All right, well, welcome everyone to the second of a 7-week series here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for everybody joining us on Facebook. As with last time, I will be giving I can't guarantee that I won't go a little over time this time. I got a little carried away making this one. So hopefully I will keep it interesting. And once again, if you have a question or something, raise your hand and I'd be happy to answer it in the middle or afterward. On Facebook, you're welcome to enter a question and translate it to me as well. So, as you can see here, the title of this week's presentation is In Defense of Faërie, J.R.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. 39 called On Fairy Stories, as I'm sure you can guess, which was then revised and eventually published in the mid-1940s. As the title applies, this basically lays out Tolkien's philosophy of myth, of the fairy story, which probably has a broader definition than most of us are used to hearing. And so this is sort of the foundation of his entire worldview about really everything related to language and story. So I'm going to open with just the opening few lines of Tolkien's lecture because I think they're a great introduction. I propose to speak about fairy stories, though I'm aware that this is a rash adventure. Faërie is a perilous land, and in it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. And overbold I may be accounted, for though I have been a lover of fairy stories since I learned to read and have at times thought about them, I have not studied them professionally. I have been hardly more than a wandering explorer or trespasser in a land full of wonder but not of information. I would contest Tolkien's contention that he is not full of information, and I will be relaying that information that hopefully I have gotten from him. So as I said, this is a lecture he gave in 1939. This was 2 years after The Hobbit was published, and some of the essay is a reflection upon what he had written there and the way his views had developed. Revised throughout the 40s and eventually published in 1947. The editors of this version of the book, which is the most comprehensive version of the book that's been published, Berlin Flieger and Douglas Anderson, call it a landmark in its field, a view that I think is shared, generally speaking, by people interested in this topic. So obviously talking about fairy stories, the first question is, what is it? What are we going to define it as? I think these are probably the images that come to mind for most people. We have Grimm fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen, and of course Walt Disney, who sort of brought the fairy story into the modern age in the 20th century. But for Tolkien, the idea of a fairy tale or a fairy story as something that was just about goblins and dragons and witches existing in this fictional land and telling stories about them is too narrow a definition. And he was especially not a fan of Walt Disney, whom he thought had really corrupted and ruined fairy stories. He said, "I recognize his talent, but it has always seemed to me hopelessly corrupted. Though in most of the pictures proceeding from his studios there are admirable or charming passages, the effect of all of them is to me disgusting. Some have given me nausea." And so Tolkien was really he thought that the fairy story had become debased in a lot of ways, that it had been brought down to a level that people thought was good for children and had lost the potency that it used to contain back when it was taken more seriously. And so his exploration of the audience for fairy story is something that is a strong focus of this lecture. So as I said, he thinks they're more than stories about creatures. Fairy stories are really about what he calls capital F fairy. He doesn't call it capital F fairy, but he writes it in this way, with a capital F and a diaeresis over the E, which means it should technically be pronounced Faërie, because he's really giving this a kind of lofty sounding name in order to really separate it from the corrupted and debased version of the simple lowercase f, F-A-I-R-Y. And so here in this passage he sort of lays out what he thinks. Faërie contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. And so this is really what he's saying. You know, you have, of course, the fantastical elements that everyone thinks of. You have the goblins, the trolls, dwarfs, all of these different fantastical creatures are certainly contained there. But the point of Faërie is not about these things, at least not directly. It's about human interaction with them. Faërie is a land that in some sense does exist external to humanity, but it's our relationship with it and our interaction with it that really gives it its purpose and meaning. And so he sets out in this lecture to say, here's where it comes from, here's why it's important, and here's what we could learn from studying it. And so as sort of the expanded version of what he had just said there is this, that most good fairy stories are about the aventure of men in the perilous realm or upon its shadowy marches. Naturally so, for if elves are true and really exist independently of our tales about them, then this is also certainly true. Elves are not primarily concerned with us, nor are we with them. Our fates are sundered and our paths seldom meet. Even upon the borders of Faërie, we encounter them only at some chance crossing of the ways. And the magic of Faërie is not an end in itself, its virtue is in its operations. Among these are the satisfaction of certain primordial human desires. And so this is, again, this is the interaction that's the key. It's that we exist in the sort of the regular mortal plane of the world, and that aside from us, there is the fantastic. That we are in some sense responsible for. It really only exists in relation to us, and yet at the same time, if it exists within us and not in some sense externally, then we learn nothing from it. If it's simply a part of who we are, then we can't go and explore it. We have to look inward for it, and therefore it loses the idea of the aventure, as he says. And interestingly, what he says here is actually very similar to what a critic would write in 1957 of The Lord of the Rings, about fantasy in general. Douglas Parker wrote, "Fantasy should be employed not as an end, but a means toward a perception, or perceptions of reality that can be better retained and expressed in that genre than in any other." So, in investigating Faërie, Tolkien is adamant that fairy stories must be accepted and respected on their own terms. He thought that something that he had failed in The Hobbit to do was to really live into this. That if you approach fairy story with sort of a wink and a nudge, and you're sort of smiling at your kids while you're telling the story, and you're saying, well, you know, here's what's going on, but really we all know that there's not a whole lot of depth here, and that we're simply having fun. And this is something that, as a scholar of Beowulf specifically, he had been really aware of and had been horribly turned off by in the field of Beowulf studies. Specifically, something he mentions here and something he mentions a lot in Beowulf is that scholars really go into these texts and cannibalize them for things that are not related to the story. They're pulling out linguistic elements, they're trying to find anthropological, historical elements, all of which are fine and good to look for, but they completely miss the point of the story and sort of ruin it. He said after the publication of The Lord of the Rings in his 60s in an interview, that books like The Lord of the Rings, in fact any fiction, are nowadays mishandled. So often it is thought and taught that enjoyment is an illiterate reaction, and that a serious reader must take the construction to pieces, analyze, dissect, and so on. He would also compare it to, after eating a great meal, if you vomited up your food and sent it away to a laboratory to analyze it and to tell you why it tasted so good. That in doing so, you are completely missing the point and losing the experience, in the case of vomiting, literally losing the food that you had actually taken in. And so there's something in Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, his remarkably influential essay about Beowulf scholarship, an allegory that he wrote about this very problem, that I think is really beautiful, and I'll just read it off. It's not horribly long. This, as I said, is in relation to his view that scholars were almost embarrassed to be talking about Beowulf with dragons and Grendel and Grendel's mother and all these monsters that Beowulf's fighting, and that they can't really take it seriously, and so they have to sort of just accept it as elements of what it is, but not really give any respect to the story underlying it. And so this is the story that he told. A man inherited a field in which was an old accumulation of stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in building the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest he took some and built a tower. But his friends coming perceived at once without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over, with no little labor, in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some suspected a deposit of coal under the soil and began to dig for it, and even forgot the stones. They said, "This tower is a most interesting thing." But they also said, after pushing it over, "What a muddle it is in." And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, "He is such an odd fellow. Imagine using these stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why does he not restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion." But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. And so this, missing the forest for trees, missing the entire point of story is something that Tolkien is very focused on and very aware of. Which kind of raises the question, though, if it's not okay in Tolkien's mind, or not correct, to sort of go plumbing the depths for these little pieces, then what do you do to actually investigate the origin of Faërie and the origin of fairy stories? And if you listen to what I had said last time, for Tolkien, language is really the key. That there's such a unification in humanity of the human mind, as he says here. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tail are in our world coeval. Coeval is a word that means of the same age at the same time. Evil is in the word medieval, meaning middle time. So basically that all of what makes us human and gives us story, our tail, our tongue, and our mind are all the same thing in a lot of ways. They play off each other in intricate ways that are inextricable from one another. You cannot have a human without having language, and you cannot have language without having a myth, and vice versa. And so the way he goes about demonstrating this, or giving an example, is that you might think that language is actually a prerequisite for myth. I think this is probably a pretty common assumption would be, to be able to give myth, you need to have something to say it in, really. But Tolkien disputes this, and he says, as soon as we apprehend the world, as soon as we start to say, this is what we're observing, this is what the world around us is, and we start giving definition to it, and we start describing it. The example he gives is green grass. If you have an entity that is green-grass, you look down and you see it. Then his point is that really what you're doing is not only identifying the green grass as an entity, as something that is apprehendable as being separate from the world around it, from being it's not the soil, it's not the air, it's not the sky, it's something different. In addition to that, it is also a component made up of the thing and the thing that described it. And so he thinks that the adjective itself in language, as soon as you use adjectives to describe things, you're immediately creating myth. Because green in grass is then immediately applicable to almost anything. And so he says, when we can take green from grass, blue from heaven, and red from blood, we have already an enchanter's power upon one plane, and the desire to wield that power in the world external to our mind awakes. And so I think this is really where the core of Tolkien's heart is, that the beauty of language and of myth is that we, in creating language, in describing the world around us, carry with us assumptions and we detail the world around us in a way that implicitly carries a narrative, that there's description that carries with it a sense of the world and who we are in the world. And we begin to apply these adjectives in abstraction to the rest of the world around us. And so examples he gives, the green from the grass can immediately be applied to say, we say the sickly hue of someone, a sickly pallor is a green face. Forests can have silver leaves. Rams can have golden fleeces. And you can put fire in the belly of a serpent. All of these abstractions that are built upon our basic apprehensions of the world are then immediately used by us. We internalize them, and then we give them back out into the world. So as we take in this information and we rationalize the world and understand the world, we as human beings, Tolkien thinks, are naturally inclined to then give it back and say, okay, this is what the world says it is and what we see the world is, and this is what we ourselves put onto the world in return. And so he says, in such fantasy, that is in these basic, simple abstractions, that this is the birth of myth. So in such fantasy, new form is made. Faërie begins, and man becomes a sub-creator. Now, this word sub-creator is probably not one you've heard before. It's something that Tolkien invented. And I will be getting into it later, but know that it is very exciting. And you should be very excited to hear about it. But this is, the birth of Tolkien's view about language and myth. And so he says, okay, so we have this then. So we have my belief that myth is that Faërie is founded in these abstractions. That we create Faërie almost automatically once we create language. But then he says, well, that's the case, but it also seems to me that people don't give Faërie any credit. They'll say, well, the Olympians and the Norse gods and all these pantheons are somehow set aside. They're different. That we have these grand mythologies from these different cultures, and that they have some kind of special place. And that fairy stories, the ones that contain sort of a lower level of maybe, I don't know, dignity, are somehow just a separate category that is not worthy of the same respect as what we think of as mythology typically. But he thinks that there is absolutely no distinction between the two. They are 100% the same thing. That a story about an elf queen is the same as the story about the Olympic gods going to war in Troy. And so this quote at the bottom here is really where he sort of argues for this point. He says, the gods may derive their color and beauty from the high splendors of nature, but it was man who obtained these for them, abstracted them from sun and moon and cloud. Their personality they get direct from him. The shadow or flicker of divinity is upon them, they receive through him from the invisible world, the supernatural. And so what he's saying here is that the gods only exist in the exact same way that Faërie does. That we as humans have this tie to the supernatural world. That this flicker of divinity that we are able to impart upon the gods is their only source of power. They don't have an existence outside of us. Because when we say, okay, Thor, the god of thunder, is thunder, we impart him divinity, but of course he doesn't really have anything until we give it to him, until we say, well, we're going to pull you from the thunder and give you this personality, this personhood that must come from us. Personality can only exist from a person. And so we impart ourselves onto the gods and give them reality in the same way that we do with the elves and sprites and dwarfs of Faërie. And then he delved into this point he has about the tragedy that is the modern Faërie story. And so he says, great, so now I've established that myth and Faërie are the same thing, that they're intrinsically bound up in humanity, in spite of sort of the bad rap that they've gotten in the wider world. But he thinks the real tragedy of Faërie story lies in what happened to them with sort of the Brothers Grimm era. That the Faërie story has been debased to this point where it's just shoved away to the nursery. That the only people that are thought of as having any legitimate reason to like it are children. And worse still, they will take these stories and they'll even remove some of the elements from them and say, well, this is the story, but we're going to take out some of the nasty parts we don't like, and we're going to give them to our children. So not only are we saying they're not fit for adults, they're not even fit for children. They have to be hacked up and sort of corrupted, basically. And I would compare, this is not a comparison Tolkien makes, but I would compare this basically to, taking the Mona Lisa and showing it to a bunch of kids and saying, well, they can't really appreciate the details, so we'll just sort of paint over the finer details of the Mona Lisa. We'll just give her a very basic facial shape. I also think it's similar to if you have a nice, grand, ornate table that you eat dinner, at which you eat dinner, and you say, well, the children can't see over the table, so you just hack the legs off so that the kids can sit there and look at the top of the table, rather than allowing the children to have a sort of connection with something greater than themselves. And so this really is Tolkien's point, is Faërie stories banished in this way, cut off from a full adult art, would be in the end ruined, would insofar as they had been banished, indeed insofar as they had been so banished, they have been ruined. So, because adults have gotten rid of fairy stories from their lives and said, we are better than these, and we are not, they provide nothing for us, and therefore our children, they have been ruined. Because children cannot write their own fairy stories. They can make up stories, but they can't obviously create a legitimate, complex tale in the same way that an adult can. And so the fairy story has been left in this state of decay. And something that I think that this raises, and that Tolkien thinks as well, is that if this is the way that we treat fairy stories, if this is what we get out of fairy stories and say, well, look, they're just ridiculous, really, and they have nothing to tell us, then what does this mean for us? What are we saying about the people that came up with them, the people in our own past, our ancestors who wove these stories, that in Tolkien's mind sort of birthed fairy into existence with their language, and really created this world out of their own pure creative thought. And I think you must assume that they're fools. They're fools. They're ignorant. They're a bunch of effectively children. We're saying all these stories that you made, they're not even fit for. They're barely fit for our children. And so everything that you made is effectively worthless to us. And so it's something that I think is incredibly insulting. And what immediately springs to mind is what C.S. Lewis would call chronological snobbery. C.S. Lewis, in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, reflecting on his time as an atheist, said that he suffered from the delusion of chronological snobbery, which he defined as the uncritical acceptance of the intellectual climate to our own age, and the assumption that whatever has gone out of date is on that account discredited. So basically, that the progress of human civilization gives us progress, nothing but progress, and everything that came before is childish or foolish or ignorant, and that it has nothing to tell us about the world. And something that C.S. Lewis would obviously want to strongly renounce. And so, I think that, and this is something obviously Tolkien believed as well. This quote at the bottom here is something that he wrote in The Lord of the Rings. The character Boromir is talking to an elf lord and says, "But what I have just heard seems to me, for the most part, old wise tales, such as we tell to our children." And the elf Celeborn responds, "Do not despise the lore that has come down from distant years, for oft it may chance that old wives keep in memory word of things that once were needful for the wise to know." And I think this is really the point that Tolkien wants to make, is that there's a resonant cultural memory that exists in these tales, that there's something deeply human in fairy that we cannot get away from, and we shouldn't try to get away from, and we shouldn't be embarrassed of. And that to be embarrassed of it really is, in a way, childish, as I'll get into here. This is something that this heart of a child idea is something that Tolkien writes, that we have lost our ability to embrace the world in a way that children do. And not that children are obviously the metric by which we should live our lives. We shouldn't try to become literal children or live as Peter Pans. But Tolkien says, "He who would enter into the kingdom of fairy should have the heart of a little child. Humility and innocence do not necessarily imply an uncritical wonder, nor indeed an uncritical tenderness." And of course here it seems pretty clear that he's echoing Christ in the book of Matthew, who said, "Unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So a very strong echo there. And I think they're both pointing at the same thing. Christ was not saying, act like a child. He was saying, you need to have, there are things that children have ready access to within their own psychologies that we lose as adults. And the bottom quote here is from C.S. Lewis in his work, 3 Ways of Writing for Children. And he says, "To be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it is grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish, these are the marks of childhood and adolescence." And then he too actually goes on to quote the Bible in the same passage, saying, "When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up." And this is an echo of Paul in 1 Corinthians, who says, "When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me." And so C.S. Lewis is sort of playing into an irony here and saying that, well, to be afraid of being considered a child is to be a child. That the only people that should be legitimately concerned about being thought to be childish are generally adolescents who are trying to live into their adulthood. C.S. Lewis in that same passage says that when he was 10, he was afraid and would hide of reading these fairy stories, and now that he's 50, he reads them openly and advocates for them. Interestingly enough, I also recall a passage that C.S. Lewis wrote to his niece, where he said she was about 15, and he said, "Soon you'll be old enough to read fairy stories again." The same kind of idea that there's in C.S. Lewis's mind an ability to return to that childhood once you accept it. But I think both he and Tolkien would agree that people have a very strong unwillingness to do so, that they're afraid of accepting that. And so, as I said, I don't think Tolkien is obviously not saying that the growth itself into adulthood is a bad thing, that we should be afraid of it. Obviously, it's natural and an important part of being human, but that we should see children as being on the same continuum that we are. That children are not categorically different from we are. And in an interview he gave in 1957, he was talking with the interviewer about how children tend to be drawn to things that are a little bit beyond their comprehension to some degree, like the Arthurian legends being attractive to young children. And he said, "Children aren't a class. They are merely human beings at different stages of maturity. All of them have a human intelligence which, even at its lowest, is a pretty wonderful thing, and the entire world in front of them." And so it's something that really, I think, is important to note, is that there's nothing embarrassing about childhood. Not every aspect of childhood should be lived into as an adult, but there are certainly aspects of childhood that are important to retain in one's mind. And so Tolkien's concern here broadly, as I sort of mentioned before, is that if adults refuse the fairy story and are embarrassed of it and refuse to interact with it, then it's never going to be a genuine art. It's never going to regain its foothold as legitimate, introspective literature. And so the sooner that adults come around and say, well, I'm now going to actually start caring and trying to actually consider this, the sooner that these stories can be more incisive and can be more legitimately interpretable as telling us a lot about ourselves. And so then he goes on to say so now he's laid out, of course, everything that he believes about the origin of Faërie and about how it is important to us, but this is for him how exactly it works, what the point of fantasy is, how it functions, and what its goals are. And so this is where he invented a term that has sort of since passed into generally popular use, the secondary world. This is something that he said needs to have a inner consistency of reality. And so once this secondary world is created, once the author of the fantasy constructs a world and creates what Tolkien calls secondary belief, this is something he puts in contrast with Samuel Taylor Coleridge's idea of the willing suspension of disbelief, which is sort of a popularly known phrase that describes how people interact with something that is not literally true in order to buy into it. Tolkien thinks it's wrong-headed to assume or to refer to it as a willing suspension of disbelief, because that puts the sort of onus on the reader or on the listener, whereas he thinks it's completely basically on the author to construct this world. That the author builds this world that either is believable or is not believable. And so people go into this world and are captivated by it, and the art of this inner consistency of reality is transmitted to them. And once they're living in this world, it now gives them access to whatever truths the author is imparting through the secondary world. He says this is a sort of double-edged sword, because people are captivated by the differences. So when you set up this world that has these differences. In Tolkien's case, of course, you have the hobbits and the elves and the dwarves and all these different races. And that, he says, captivates people and draws them in. But at the same time, the farther you go from the primary world, as our world, the world of literal apprehensible reality, the more likely it is that the world will fail to create secondary belief. And so fantasy in this form must exist on this very fine line where it is fantastical and captivating and pushes the limits into basically archetype, but also has to retain believability. And so he says it's very difficult and almost it's rarely achieved, this sort of pure secondary world. And this somewhat long passage here is from a poem that Tolkien wrote called Mythopoeia. And this poem was actually written in the early 1930s after he went on a walk with C.S. Lewis at Oxford. And C.S. Lewis was still, at this time, an atheist. And Tolkien addressed this to him, and the address of the poem is Philomythos to Mesomythos, lover of myths to the hater of myths, because C.S. Lewis had said that myths were beautiful things, but that they were lies breathed through silver, that he loved myths, but that he saw there was no real legitimacy to them. And so Tolkien's idea of fantasy, of myth, is summed up in this poem, that excerpt of which is here. Although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seeds of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed, we make still by the law in which we're made. And this is probably not quite clear as to what he's saying without wider context, but you can see that he's really going into the fall, the idea of the fall. So man is estranged from God, that man has fallen away from perfect creation that was in God's eyes. And he is now literally disgraced. He hyphenates the word disgraced here. He has lost grace. But he retains an image of Eden, you might say. He retains something of creation in himself. And so when human beings go into the world and alter the world around them, they are engaging in what Tolkien calls sub-creation. That is, that God is the creator, and that God made manifest from nothing the entire universe and all that's in it, and that we, in imitation or flattery, or you might even think it somewhat rebellious, and Tolkien did so in his own mythology, that we are acting out the story of creation ourselves. And so for him, fantasy is not a lie. It is a recapitulation of the original creation. It is a way that we get closer to God without knowing it. I don't know how well the audio is going to come through here, but this is an interview from him in 1962 in which he sort of lays this out a little bit as well. I will give a reading of what he said afterward, because he's sort of not clear.
That he would call us being made by a creator. One of our natural practices is wishing to create. But since we aren't creators, we have to sub-create. That's the rearrange the primary material in some particular form which pleases us, which isn't necessarily a moral pleasing, it's partly aesthetic pleasing.
And so what he says there is, I think that because we are made by a creator, a natural fact is wishing to create. But since we aren't creators, we have to sub-create. That is, to rearrange the primary material in some particular form, which pleases. It isn't necessarily a moral pleasing, it's partly an aesthetic pleasing. And so this was something that he really believed profoundly, that in his own creation of fantasy, and anyone's creation of fantasy, or fiction more broadly to some lesser degree, that we are at all times driven by a desire to act in imitation of God. because God is within all of us, and therefore we, of course, have a pale imitation of God's own creative capacity in our desire to create. And so therefore we play with the toys that God has given us, effectively. We can't make anything ourselves, but we can rearrange what God has given us into new forms, and sort of look doughy-eyed up at God and ask for approval, even if we don't know we're doing so. And so now that we sort of, know that Tolkien views us not only as a fundamentally human experience, but also a very religious experience, which to some degree for Tolkien is the same thing. That obviously, being a devout Catholic, he would have thought that this fundamental urge is of course rooted in God, but very much so. That he has basically three primary effects that come from Faërie story, all of which are tied into this kind of deeply human and religious experience that he calls recovery, escape, and consolation. And so the first is recovery. And he sets this up by saying, the reason really that children have this love or this capacity for Faërie story, for living in Faërie or interacting with Faërie, is that as we grow old, we lose our connection. We lose our sort of implicit fascination with the world. We see everything around us happening over and over again, and therefore we lose interest in it. The world becomes drab, it becomes familiar, nothing is remarkable anymore. When spring arrives at the end of winter every year, it becomes a rote thing. It becomes something that is no longer interesting, even though the spring itself is different. We have this flattening urge, where we flatten everything into just regular experience, and we lose the ability to see the real beauty that lies at the heart of the world. And so he says, to free ourselves, we may be tempted to increase the complexity of these things we find so dull. So that when you see the dullness, you say, well, I can fix this by making it more complicated. You see these colors, you say, well, there's only three primary colors, but if I mix them all together and kind of just like add more into it, it'll fix this problem, and I'll get this kind of new high, I guess you might say. But of course, as we know, if you start mixing stuff together, it just becomes muddy. If you start increasing if you grow bored of squares and circles, and you start adding multifaceted, huge number of sides, polygons, they become unusable effectively. They become impossible. They become overly complex. And so really the idea is to regrow that kind of love, that childlike, apprehensible ability of the world. That when we see something that is beautiful, we are able to reclaim the beauty in our own minds. And so this is the recovery. It's the recovery of the love of God's creation in a lot of ways. And so another way he describes it is that recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view, seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. And so another dimension of this sort of loss of this, apprehension is that this ties into what he was saying at the beginning of this lecture about we have to have Faërie be external. And so when we are sort of consuming the world with our senses, we're just folding it into ourselves. We're losing the reason that the world gets flattened around us is that we are subsuming all of it. We're trying to contain it within ourselves and to say, well, I now have all these pieces of information that are no longer interesting and that are simply bland facts that exist in the back of my mind. We throw them, like the Faërie story, we throw them into the nursery and just lock them away and never look at them again. He says, apart from ourselves, we need to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. This separation. And so, the real potent element of this that he sees is that fantasy is the perfect way to do this. That fantasy is the perfect way of recapturing this essence, because, as he said about the birth of language and the birth of myth, that it's in these myths that we really give any sense of potency to anything that exists in the world. That you know, when we look at something, or when we did look at something when we were you know, more primitive, you know, or when we were younger in culture, we ascribed to it this personality and this almost a personhood that didn't exist intrinsically, that we built for it. It was Pegasus. It was the idea of Pegasus that gave us the idea of the nobility of horses. It was the sword Excalibur that gave nobility and grace to iron. And he says, for the story maker who allows himself to be free with nature can be her lover and not her slave. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of words and the wonder of the things such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. And so for Tolkien, you regain this ability to see the world in fresh ways through fantasy and through myth and abstraction. And I can say that on a personal note, this is very much for me the way that I sort of regained my faith and my ability to sort of look at the world in a childlike way. It's having these abstractions that when you look at a beautiful landscape, you call to mind some mythical story. It's not just a sunset. It's the sun setting on some ancient shore or something. You know, there are these beautiful images that contain more than just their own essence, and that is an interplay that is intrinsically human. It's deeply human, because humans are the ones that grant this meaning. That God, in some sense, put us here to interact with the world and to have this beautiful, you know, co-living experience with nature. That we exist with nature to do this in some way. The second element, besides recovery, is escape. And this is something that is frequently leveled at Tolkien all the way back when The Lord of the Rings came out, and certainly still now to some degree, is escapism, that his stories are escapist, or really that fairy in general is escapist, that it only functions in order to, you know, give us a way out of the world and to free us from political responsibility, you might say, as one person put it in 1968. But Tolkien embraces the term. He says escape is one of the main functions of fairy story. It is absolutely important. I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is so now often used. In what the misusers are fond of calling real life, escape is evidently, as a rule, very practical and may even be heroic. And so he thinks that there's a real hypocrisy to the way that people talk about escape. He says that it's only in the case of fairy stories that people say that escape is a bad thing. And so his image that he conjures up here is, why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls. The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. And so we live, in some sense, you know, it may sound a little dramatic, but we live in some sense in a prison of our you know, five senses. That we have confined ourselves into this world of you know, losing this ability that we want to recover, of seeing the world as beautiful and as a product of God's creation, and that all these brilliant scientists and modernists say that you should just live in what they call the real world, and that really they're just all they're doing is missing the point. They're confusing, he says, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. And that when we escape from this world in fantasy, we're not running away from responsibility, we're going back into a different mode of thinking. We're looking at the world through a different lens, not running away from the world. And this is something he said when asked about it in an interview in 1960.
Well, it's meant to be escapist, because I use escapism in its proper sense. As a man getting out of prison.
If you couldn't quite catch that, this snarky little grin he gives there, he said, it is escapist, because I use escapism in its proper sense as a man getting out of prison. And so nothing more than what he says here, but he gives a snarky little grin, because this is to him very, a point that he has clearly won over his critics, which they would not agree with, of course, but that it's the escape of the prisoner is a noble action. It's a noble action because you're doing it in order to retain and regain an image of divine creation. And I evidently have slides out of order here, unfortunately. This is another element of recovery, which is that fantasy. Oh no, this is still escape. I just have the wrong label there. Sorry. Tolkien is somewhat known for his sort of dismal view of the modern world, and so he characterizes the escape as a removal from a world that is transient. That people who are modernists are obsessed with sort of whatever's in vogue at the time. And so the Industrial Revolution hit, in the late 19th century, and by Tolkien's time had ballooned into giant factories everywhere, and cars were going around. There were electric lamps on the streets, and all these different things. But he saw even then, and what we see certainly now, is that as the world keeps marching along and innovating, all of these things that are so modern are immediately lost within a span of a couple of years, and they're gone forever. They fall into obsolescence and shabbiness, and they never regain any respect. And so there's something, and a key difference about fantasy, and about Faërie, which is that this never happens. There's not some distance away from the fairy world that we're getting that we then look back and say, well, we've moved far beyond that. Some people think that. They think of that on a different level even than what Tolkien's talking about here. They think that the world has moved intellectually beyond Faërie. Tolkien thinks, of course, that we haven't. And he says, the claim that automobiles are more alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. And so what he's getting at here is that automobiles will be gone at some point. They're not going to last forever, and nobody's going to romantically look back on automobiles and tell legends about the great cars of the 1940s. That wouldn't make any sense. It certainly is going to happen. But dragons and centaurs will live forever. They're never going to disappear. They're never going to be something that is passed out of the transience of the modern world, because they don't exist chronologically. They're not something that is tied to the progress of the world. They're something that is a deeply felt fairy truth about the world. And even saying that they're more real than horses, or more important than horses, those being the former means of transportation, is also ridiculous. That you're saying that even to say that in the sense in which they're talking about progress, that we've moved from horses to cars, somehow means that cars matter more than horses, or that they're more relevant than horses, is ridiculous, and that they're completely missing the boat on what it is to be human. And so his final point about escape, the point about the evolution of the modern world is he talks about it in some more precise terms, saying that there's no necessary improvement, that people argue that the modern world is in a state of improvement. But he says, well, in science fiction stories, which is sort of in many ways the opposite of fantasy, in many ways it's very similar, but it's also somewhat the opposite in that it looks forward, it's speculative. That in these stories, the future that's predicted is still full of people as lustful, vengeful, and greedy as ever. And that we are really maybe just moving toward an age of improved means to deteriorated ends. And so that there's no necessary, the belief that in progress, in the advance of the industrial world to this state of higher order and purpose is not really that at all. That there's nothing about humanity itself that is changing. Humanity remains the same throughout time. All that's changing is what is the apparatus that humanity has to interact with the world. And so relying on that solely is to rely on something that is functionally useless in the aims that Tolkien has. One other interesting point is that Tolkien calls the Great Escape, which is the escape from death. And so this ties into what I was just saying, which is that he believes very firmly that death and the desire for deathlessness, as he put it, is at the core of basically all human story, which you may agree with or not, but this is his point, and it doesn't really matter whether or not that's literally true. His point is here that if you want to know anything about humans' desire for deathlessness and the desire for immortality, you're not going to find it anywhere in science. You maybe will find, what the life expectancy, what the maximum life expectancy of humans will ever be without some kind of technology. But even if humans attain the ability to live forever, you will still not learn anything about that inclination or that desire without fantasy or without some kind of appeal to something outside of science. And so, of course, he thinks, what better source than the world of Faërie, in which we have immortal beings that interact with us, and we have created, effectively, to tell us why we desire immortality. And so the final step of the final process that is allowed for by Faërie story is what he calls constellation. And this is where he really delves in. This is sort of the final blending of Christianity, myth, language, story. All of this stuff for Tolkien is bound up in constellation. And so he says, far more important than any imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires, which is what he says maybe is found in escape and in recovery, is the consolation of the happy ending. And he coined this term eucatastrophe, E-U catastrophe, which he called the true form of the fairy tale and its highest function. Eucatastrophe means a sudden good turn. The word catastrophe in Greek, obviously our word catastrophe means something bad. In Greek it means simply a turn, a sudden turn. So the eucatastrophe is the sudden turn toward good. As he says, the sudden and happy turn back to joy at the moment of greatest despair. And if you're familiar with Tolkien, specifically in The Lord of the Rings and elsewhere, you'll know that this is something that he incorporates very profoundly. This is something that he really believes, that eucatastrophe, that the turn, that at the brink of despair, grace steps in effectively, is the greatest of all stories. That the eucatastrophe is absolutely critical. And so it's not just a divine, it's not just a happy ending. It's not just the turn toward a good ending. It's a divine ending. This is tied to God. In its fairy tale setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. And the other term he coins, discatastrophe, which is the opposite, a sudden turn toward the bad. In the face of discatastrophe, in the face of sorrow and evil, eucatastrophe is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. And so this, for Tolkien, is the evangelium, is the return of Christ. So at the end of days, Christ comes back to earth, redeems humanity for the final time, and that we have glimpses of this final return in these moments of eucatastrophe. That God, in His grace, will redeem the world, and that we, in our imitation, tell stories in which we presage that, unconsciously in a lot of ways, but that in this story we say, this is what I as a human being am deeply longing for, and that I am imitating what I desire from God. And so really what he says here, beauties which pierce like swords, I think is very appropriate. It's from a review that C.S. Lewis wrote of Fellowship of the Ring. And he says, Tolkien says, it is the mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, and having a peculiar quality. And so it is intentional, and it's an intentional product of a great fairy story to make you cry. It's to make you weep. It is to give you a profound feeling of poignant joy and sorrow mixed into the same experience. And so, at last, then, he says explicitly all of this coming together here. And he says the Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. he says, I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect, as to others of their strange nature. That for him, the birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of the history of mankind. That the fall created the state of decay that we live in. And that when Christ was born, it was a moment of divine grace, a moment of divine intervention that broke back turned back the tide of evil. And that within the story of Christ's own incarnation, the story of the resurrection is the catastrophe. And so when at the moment of greatest despair, the death of Christ, 3 days later Christ rises, and so the birth and death of Christ bookend the story of Christ. And so the story of Christ begins and ends in joy. And in the story of Christ, this is where we truly feel and are able to see what God is doing. And as Tolkien says here, it's something that God is really coming down to our level to do. God is almost imitating us in a more perfect way. We tell these stories of eucatastrophe in order to fulfill a deep longing desire within us. And God comes down and deigns to do the exact same thing. He brings eucatastrophe into the primary world. We're only able to do it, of course, in the secondary world that we construct. But God, of course, can do it in our own world. And so God brings Christ literally into being in our world as a eucatastrophe. And so the beauty of this is that we, of course, know when we hear these stories how poignant it feels to feel the eucatastrophe at the end of some story. And you will weep at the end of a movie or the end of a book that has this feeling for you. And how much more profound, if we can evoke that own reaction in ourselves, how much more can God evoke it in the real world? That God evokes it in the primary world, in primary belief, you might say. So God is validating us. He comes down and says, look, I know where you are in the world, and I know how you feel, I know what the fallen existence is. And I'm telling you that what you're feeling is correct. That when you tell these stories, you really are coming at it from the way that I want you to come at it. That I love you and I will bring about the transformation at the end of days. And this is why Tolkien thinks that this happens. Because he says there is no tale ever told that men would rather find true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits, as Christianity. That it's such a deeply entrenched desire within us that all people everywhere have this same experience. And so now that God has told us that through Christ that our eucatastrophe is coming, that he does love us, that it has already happened and will happen again, Tolkien says, the Christian still has work to do with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die. But he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose which can be redeemed.